the crisis of the church, the Catholic Church. What you see is a sunset at St. Peter's. Very peaceful sunset. On the evening of February 11th, 2013, a bolt of lightning struck St. Peter's tomb, the Prince of the Apostles. It was the night that Pope Benedict XVI departed the papacy. Question is, does he continue as the Vicar of Christ? It all began with Pope Paul VI in 65, when he said the smoke of Satan infiltrated the Vatican. How true that was. Cardinal Gagnon, appointed by Pope Paul VI to investigate Vatican Freemasonry and corruption. He never got to present his report, which took 3 years to complete. Pope Paul was too sick to read the report. He said, pass it on to the next pope. Archbishop Bugnini, he was a secret Freemason in 65. When the Pope learned about that, he exiled him for life to Iran. Pope St. John Paul II promoted the Catholic faith worldwide. He was traveling around the world to speak to the youth, millions of youth. And together with Margaret Thatcher and President Reagan, they were able to destroy the communism in the USSR and most of the East. There's a picture of him. Pope Benedict had many liberal enemies in the Vatican and throughout the world, bishops. So, to quote him, it was a dramatic struggle between the so-called Salt of the Earth party, including cardinals listed there, and a group called the St. Gallen Group. And he defined that as a kind of mafia club. So Cardinal Ratzinger was elected the 265th Pope in April 2005. Of course, he allegedly retired in 2013. So the question is, did the Pope retire? Now, Canon Law 332-2 says that if the Roman Pontiff resigns his office, it is required for validity that his resignation must be freely made and properly manifested. He must resign without pressure, willingly, mentally, and spiritually. So, Benedict has not given up his name or his white cassock, and the correct way to address him when you meet him at the Vatican or at St. Peter's is Your Holiness. Now, Dr. Edmund Mazza has more details on what is called munus, and he claims that Pope Benedict has not renounced him munus. You can go to his website there at edmundmazza.com. So what are some of the imminent disasters that we experienced and will experience? The global mortal calamities is obviously it's the pandemic, which is ongoing. The recession will hit us probably in August. We've got the Russian-Ukraine war, Communist China, Middle East terrorism, and allegedly climate change. Now, these scandals are political, and now I'm talking about the church leaders, the church scandals, Catholic Church. Now, Christ's doctrines with the apostles are unchangeable. So what we do and don't do in life has eternal consequences. This is a painting I made about a year ago, an oil painting of Sacred Heart of Jesus. Now, the church can be without a pope. The longest papal interval between popes was between 304 to 308, over 3.5 years. Theologians teach that the church can exist for decades without a pope because the bishops have power. So the question is, why does God, Jesus Christ in particular, allow evil to exist? Here are some of the Catholic traditions on free will and evil. By virtue of his soul and spiritual powers of intellect and free will, man is endowed with freedom, an outstanding manifestation of divine image. That is in the CCC is the Catholic Catechism. It is not easy for man wounded by original sin of Adam and Eve to maintain moral balance. Christ's gift of salvation offers man his grace. Grace is essential in our pursuit of wisdom. Now, our choice is to accept God's grace, or we can reject it. The Catechism of the Catholic Church is the CCC referenced there. No pope can change Christ's doctrines. Here's a picture of me when I was in the Holy Land in Jerusalem. That was 2008. Now, Christianity has survived 2,000 years of wars and major calamities. We should always proclaim God's truth. I'm carrying a very light cross there. That guy with the sunglasses in the background with the white hat is a priest, a friend of mine, Father Charles. He's been to the Holy Land 40 times. He's about 89 years old. Leaders are obviously defined by their challenges. You had World War II greatly challenged Pope Pius XII. I was born in 1938, so I experienced Pius XII. He's one of my heroes. Communists severely tested Pope John Paul II. Pope Benedict faced internal Vatican evils and evil bishops around the world. Pope Francis' trials are modernism, which Pope Pius X warned us about. Modernism and his leadership. Now, this author experienced these chaotic events. It left an enduring imprint on this writer. There's the Pope looking at a symbol of Jesus Christ, a sickle and a hammer made into a crucifix. If one listens to Francis or reads his books, as I have, he is openly promoting socialism, extreme socialism. So what is socialism? Here's some quotes from two popes, Pope Pius XI and St. John Paul II. Okay, I'll read St. John Paul II. Socialism maintains that the good of the individual can be realized without reference to his free choice, to the unique and exclusive responsibility which he exercises in the face of good and evil. So the key issue for all Christians and Catholics is Francis' socialism, his socialism views, his novel, very novel, moral theology. So leadership, of course, starts at the top. You got, in this country, the President, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. 3 branches. The bishops wear red robes, which symbolizes their willingness to shed their blood to protect the church. So bishops' duty is to teach 3 things. Teach the Gospels, shepherd the flock, and they must submit to sacred pledges. The Vicar of Christ, if you read Matthew 16:19, is the successor to Peter chosen by Christ. He is given the keys to heaven and hell. Pope Francis said publicly, "I am not the Vicar of Christ. So who controls the keys to heaven and hell? I might add, to be silent before error is to be repulsive to God. So here's Pope Francis' novel moral theology. This writer, Larry Chapp of the National Catholic Register in July this year, said his moral theology is proportionalism or consequentialism. So the Pope wants to correct what he considers overemphasis on natural law and moral reasoning. That's his exact words. So if we read the Bible, the Apostle Paul said, when Peter came to Antioch, I told him face to face. Now, Peter was the first pope. Face to face that he was wrong. He used to eat with the Gentiles, followers of the Lord, until James sent some Jewish followers. Peter was afraid of the Jews and soon stopped eating with the Gentiles. So here we have Apostle Paul, like any bishop or archbishop or cardinal, correcting the Pope, the first Pope, Peter. So bishops have a moral duty to correct grave errors of any pope. St. Paul also said, when I saw that they were not really obeying the truth that is in the good news, the gospel, I corrected Peter in front of everyone. Thus, Catholics must correct Pope Francis when he is in error. Not me, but the bishops and cardinals of the world. Here are the 7 major traditional Orthodox Catholic standards that we follow. These are very critical. If you follow them, you're okay. The divine law is manifest in the natural law. Freedom makes man responsible for all their acts. Our acts are either good or evil. Here we have Pope Francis embracing this disgraced cardinal, Theodore McCarrick. That was when he visited the U.S. in 2015. McCarrick was a decadent leader of sexual perversions for 35 or 40 years. He sanctioned many decadent bishops in New Jersey, in Chicago, in San Diego, in Washington, D.C., in the Vatican, and in North and South America. He was a disgrace. And here we have the Pope smiling and hugging him. Now, in July 22nd in Rome, Speaker Nancy Pelosi was with Pope Francis. She received Holy Communion during a papal mass in St. Peter's. So Pope Francis observed sacrilegious acts, but he did not respond, did not react. So the Supreme Court on Roe v. Wade said it is not constitutional. They did not alter it. They threw it out. They said it's not constitutional. All the decisions about abortion must be made by the states. So the 50 states can decide for themselves. Pope Francis said regarding Roe v. Wade, I respect their decision, but had not studied it enough to comment on it. Really, after 63 million deaths of preborn children, 63 million in the U.S., he has not studied it enough? Well, he has lots of lawyers at the Vatican who can inform him. Does Pope Francis sanction these scandals? That's the question. He said, and I quote, when the church loses its pastoral nature, or a bishop loses his pastoral nature, it causes political problems. Obviously, it causes problems. And he said, that's all I'm going to say, close quotes. Then later he said, I leave it to Pelosi, and by implication, Biden's conscience. They should talk to their bishops for direction. But who selects the bishops and cardinals? Pope Francis does. Now, St. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 11:27, quote, whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of profaning the body and blood of the Lord, close quotes. So that's a complete contradiction to what Paul wrote in the Bible. Now here are two examples of archbishops. One is the leader of Chicago Catholic Church. He's a proponent of LGBTQ. Then you have Archbishop Gregory of Washington, D.C. He's a proponent of communion for all abortionists, including the President and Speaker Pelosi, among many other so-called Catholics. McCarrick, the disgraced McCarrick, praised these bishops, among others. And Pope Francis will make them cardinals on August 27th, 2022. The traditional Latin Mass existed for 1,500 years. Here's what Pope Benedict said about that. The liturgy belongs to the whole body of the Church. It is for this reason that it's not permitted for anyone, even a priest or any group, to subtract or change anything whatsoever, close quotes. Pope Francis wants to cancel traditional Latin Mass and change Orthodox Catholic teaching. Now, we all know that the government stopped religious service in 2020 and 2021. All churches, they stopped all churches, Jewish temples, Islamic mosques, any places of worship by government edict. Now, the Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. 3 times they said that. So the church canceled sacraments during Easter, the most important religious day of the year. So the question is, why did most bishops, not all, throughout the United States consent to illegal government decrees? The government lacks constitutional on anything to do with religion. Bishops have to oppose erroneous government laws. Now, later in 2018, the Vatican produced a whitewashed report. I call it whitewash. Because McCarrick endorsed corrupt bishops worldwide. As I said, New Jersey, Chicago, San Diego, D.C. And Pope Francis continued to use this disgraced archbishop between 2015 and 18. This depraved cardinal drafted the secret deal between the Vatican and Communist China. The Pope asked our Archbishop Vigano, who was the nuncio for 5 years in the U.S., about McCarrick. He knew everything about McCarrick. He didn't have to ask him. Why did Pope Francis continue to use McCarrick for the secret China deal? That's the question. That's a key issue. Plus, he used McCarrick to negotiate the deal with Communist China. Here is Secretary of State Sodano. He was the most powerful cardinal Secretary of State in the Vatican for many decades. Finally, he was told to retire by the Pope. For example, Secretary of State Sodano stopped Cardinal Ratzinger from prosecuting a decadent sex abuser. Pope Benedict finally defrocked him in 2015 when he was the Pope. He didn't have the power. Sodano stopped him. we have decades of Vatican banking scandals. They lost more than $120 million of our money we contributed to Rome, to the Vatican. Now, Pope Francis promoted this bishop to a cardinal. His name is Beck. In 2018. Then he dismissed him in 2020 after he was implicated in this banking scandals. This wonderful old cardinal, I think he's over 90 years old now, he's in jail. He was put in jail by the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party. His name is Cardinal Zen. He was made cardinal by St. John Paul II. He had serious concerns for millions of underground Catholics, obviously. And he could not even get permission to meet with the Pope, Pope Francis. So millions of Catholic children are not allowed to go to Mass. Millions of Catholic children cannot receive instruction in Communist China. Now here's the Pope blessing idols in the garden, the Vatican garden next door to St. Peter's. He also received those idols on the altar of St. Peter's Basilica. Now we should all know that God's first commandment in Exodus 23, quote, "You shall not have other gods before me." And here we have an example of public idols being blessed. The so-called Pachamama from South America, Pachamama idols. Here we have the Pope greeting Archbishop Gregory of Washington, D.C. Majority of bishops during a group meeting in D.C. area voted against communion for political abortionists. They voted against that. Dozens and dozens of the majority of bishops. Yet we have this political archbishop allowing the scandal. Then we have the celebration of the 500th year of Luther's Reformation. And the Pope says, this is the path we need to take. This is or will reform the church. Now, this is obviously false teaching as defined by traditional Catholics and the Catechism. The church's greatest reformer, Luther, was a saint, according to Francis. A saint. He was excommunicated 500 years ago. So we have examples of Pope's novel moral teaching. And I quote again, "As the family goes, so goes the church," which is true. As the church goes, so goes the family. Christian freedom depends on spiritual strength. That's obvious. Spiritual strength vastly diminishes the significance of formal rules. That's wrong. And then he had the gall to say, immoral acts could be God's will for your life right now. So that's an amazing quote. Now, we all should know that God never wills evil acts, never. Here we have the Pope kissing the Sunni leader of Islam. Sunnis represent about 85% of the Islamic population worldwide, which is about 1.5 billion. So they represent 85% of that. And Francis claims, quote, "The God of Allah and Christianity are the same," close quotes. So this is contrary to traditional Catholic Church teaching. In fact, Peter 2, 1-3 says, quote, "False prophets also arose among the people,
just as there will be also false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the Master, Christ, who brought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves, close quotes. So the first Pope spoke against this scandal.
Father Charles Murr, author of Murder in the 33rd Degree, which is a crazy title, but he was a roommate of Gagnon, who was investigating the Vatican, so he wrote a book which revealed some of the secret results of the study. But Cardinal Gagnon was sworn to secrecy with the Pope not to reveal all the secrets. Cardinal Bagnio was found to be a Freemason. He was relieved of his position. He was responsible for selecting all the bishops in the world, but it was too late. Many of those bishops are now cardinals who voted for the next Pope. Pope John Paul II focused on defeating communism, as I said earlier. Cardinal Parolin served as Secretary of State, and he was confirmed by Francis and Leo XIV. Secretary of State is the most powerful man next to the Pope. He prohibited Cardinal Ratzinger from doing his job and getting rid of some of those corrupt people in the Vatican until he became Pope Benedict XVI.
No longer Pope, or he wasn't Pope in the first place. Now, Christ died to provide redeeming mercy for sinners, all sinners. And we can freely choose to accept Jesus Christ's grace and love or not. We cannot save those who refuse Christ's grace. We should always teach the truth of the traditional faith. We should counsel and pray for all sinners.
Okay, so here's a summary. There's clear evidence of false teaching by Pope Francis. Here's a summary of the key points. Pope John I died that night after only 33 days as Pope. He was allegedly poisoned or somehow had a heart attack after arguing with the cardinal who visited him at 8 p.m. in the evening. The guards heard a serious argument between them. Then the next day he was found dead. Okay, so John Paul II was also shot by a communist hired gunman. He was saved by the St. Mary's Medal. Pope Benedict XVI replaced John Paul II. So the question is, did Pope Francis replace Benedict XVI? Not really, according to certain details, which we'll get to later.
Now, our youth today are disillusioned and demoralized. We are being misled by not only secular, self-serving leaders of the government, we're also misled by the leadership of the church in many places, including the Vatican. We have to save our misguided and confused youth. The church leadership of all these bishops and cardinals and the Vatican, their foremost goal is saving souls. I quote, "Ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Jesus Christ." It's not just untrue ideology, it's about giving our youth some meaning and purpose in their lives. So this is the voice of passionate and traditional Catholics. We need to conform to the Gospels of Jesus Christ. Here is my website, and I've formed a foundation, which is called Fertig Christian Trust Foundation Incorporated, and you can see my other YouTube on this subject. I thank you very much for listening. These are clearly chaotic and hysterical times.